Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Dictatorships. They don't really last on just brute force, do they?
No, not at all.
It's more about control, right?
Right.
Like, how do you control the narrative? How do you, shape the way people think?
Yeah, it's about crafting a narrative, and often that means, twisting what's already there.
And that brings us to, well, your request.
Mm-hmm.
We're diving deep into how dictators used, or, well, maybe even misused, ideas about race and gender to kind of solidify their grip on power.
Yeah. Looking at Hitler in Nazi Germany and Castro in Cuba, two dictators, two very different regimes, but both notorious for their, for lack of a better word, control.
And what's fascinating is, even though they were both authoritarian, their methods were totally different.
They were, and that's what makes this comparison so interesting, I think, because by seeing those differences, by seeing how they approach those similar themes in such starkly different ways, it reveals a lot about, the mechanics of power, you could say.
Exactly. It's like looking under the hood. So let's start with Nazi Germany. And we can't talk about Hitler without addressing the elephant in the room, the horrific persecution of Jewish people. This wasn't just like, oh, we don't like this group. This was core to their whole ideology.
Yeah, it was central. It was fundamental. This idea of Aryan superiority and conversely, Jewish contamination, it was baked into their entire worldview.
And they even had a name for it, right?
They did, the Volksgemeinschaft, basically meaning a racially pure national community.
And to achieve this so-called purity, they went to some really dark places. I mean, they systematically, and it's chilling how calculated it was, they systematically excluded anyone deemed undesirable.
Absolutely. And they did it step by step, slowly increasing the pressure.
Like a frog in boiling water.
Exactly. Take the 1933 Law of the Restitution of the Professional Civil Service.
What was that? I don't think I've heard of that one.
It barred Jewish people from holding positions in civil service. Now, that might seem like a small thing, a bureaucratic tweak.
Right. But it's just the beginning.
It was the first step in pushing them out of influential roles in German society.
Like a slow tightening of a noose.
Exactly. And then, boom, 1935, the Nuremberg Laws, stripping Jews of their citizenship, forbidding marriage between Jews and non-Jews. It was institutionalized segregation, plain and simple.
And it's easy to think of these as just words on paper.
But they weren't. Imagine being told you're no longer welcome in parks, cinemas, even your own place of worship simply because of your heritage. The Nuremberg Laws were designed to systematically isolate the Jewish population from every aspect of German society.
And then it all culminated in Kristallnacht in 1938. And that wasn't just a night of riots. This was planned, state-sanctioned violence against Jewish businesses, synagogues, homes. It's horrifying.
It really is. And what's even more chilling is that while some Germans were horrified, many remained silent out of fear, maybe apathy. And that's the thing about dictatorships. They thrive on that silence just as much as on active support.
It's true. That silence can be deafening.
Absolutely.
And speaking of control, the Nazis had very specific ideas about the role of women in their society, too.
Oh, absolutely. The whole Kinder, Küche, Kirche thing.
Children, kitchen, church.
Right. And that wasn't just a cute slogan. It was the reality they imposed. Women were basically seen as instruments for producing Aryan children, crucial for the nation's strength. But that was kind of it. Largely excluded from public life.
And they literally gave out medals for motherhood, didn't they? Like it was some kind of, competition.
The Mother's Cross. A bronze cross for 4 children, silver for 6, and gold for 8 or more. It's a very, very clear example of how the Nazis used, tangible rewards to pressure women into conforming to this very rigid ideal. But it's crucial to understand that this wasn't just about social engineering, right? There was a much darker, more calculated purpose at play. Well, by creating this image of the ideal German family and then demonizing anyone who didn't fit that mold, whether it was Jewish people, Roma people, LGBTQ plus individuals, political dissidents, they created this climate of fear and suspicion. And they used that to unify their base.
So it's like they created this enemy within to distract from everything else.
Exactly. Classic scapegoat.
So in a way, all this manufactured fear became a tool to consolidate power.
Precisely. It's textbook Hitler, really. I mean, his tactics were horrific, obviously, but we can't deny that they were also very calculated. He understood the power of scapegoating, how to channel fear and anger toward this, well, manufactured enemy, all to achieve his own ends. And he used it masterfully, if you can call something so horrific masterful.
That's a chilling thought. But before we get to how Castro used similar tactics in Cuba, it's important to understand just how deep this racial ideology ran in Nazi Germany. Like, how did they even enforce this on a societal level? What about the education system, for example?
Oh, absolutely. It was like their breeding ground for future generations of, perfect little Nazis.
It's just horrifying to think about.
It was incredibly effective, though.
Ugh. Okay. Well, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about Castro's Cuba. It's almost like the opposite, right? You go from this obsession with racial purity to, well, a supposedly classless society where, in theory, race doesn't matter.
Yeah, you'd think so, wouldn't you?
So did Castro actually dismantle racial hierarchies? Or was it just clever rhetoric?
It's really a mixed bag.
Yeah.
After the revolution, Castro was very vocal about, wanting to eliminate racial barriers in Cuba.
There was that famous speech he gave in 1959, right?
Exactly. And it resonated especially with Afro-Cubans who'd been dealing with systemic racism for, well, centuries, really. And his government did make some big changes. Think healthcare, education. These reforms were designed to benefit everyone equally, on paper at least. And to be fair, Afro-Cubans did see real improvements in their living standards.
So there was some tangible progress.
Oh, for sure.
But did it go far enough? I mean, did true equality actually exist in Castro's Cuba?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because, sure, overt discrimination decreased, but deep down, those racial inequalities, they never really went away.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, look at leadership roles, for example, in the government, in the military.
Afro-Cubans weren't really represented, were they?
Exactly. And we're not just talking about a few high-profile positions here. This was systemic. Like, no matter how much the regime talked about equality, there were still these ingrained prejudices holding people back.
Right, because Castro always framed inequality as a class issue.
Exactly. That was his thing, a core tenet of Marxist thought, right?
So how did that impact racial dynamics in Cuba? Because it seems like it would just brush everything else under the rug.
That's the thing. By focusing so much on class as the root of all inequality, Castro's regime, whether intentionally or not, kind of downplayed the role of race. And while it seemed inclusive on the surface, we're all in this together, fighting the evils of class.
It made it really hard to talk about race, didn't it?
Exactly. Because bringing up racial inequality was almost like, criticizing the revolution itself. It was seen as counter-revolutionary.
So if you were Afro-Cuban and still felt disadvantaged,
you were basically told to get over it. It was like, we fixed the system. Any inequality you're experiencing is on you.
Wow, so messed up.
Now, look, this isn't to say that Castro's Cuba was the same as Nazi Germany. Obviously not. The comparison breaks down very quickly on a moral level. But it's interesting, isn't it?
What's interesting?
How even regimes with totally different ideologies can end up using the same, playbook when it comes to social dynamic. How they exploit those dynamics for their own gain.
It's all about holding on to power, isn't it?
Always.
So Castro's Cuba wasn't exactly a utopia for women either, right? You said they played a significant role in the revolution itself.
Right. Women were vital to the Cuban Revolution. We can't forget about figures like Vilma Espin and Celia Sanchez.
And there was the Federation of Cuban Women, too, right? The FMC.
Yeah.
Established in 1960.
Right, the FMC. And they did some good work. They pushed for new family laws, tried to get women more involved in the workforce and politics. It was a big contrast to Nazi Germany, that's for sure.
But you said tried.
Yeah.
So what was the reality for women in Castro's Cuba? Was it all just for show? Was there a gap between what they were saying about equality and what was actually happening?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the FMC, they were all about getting women into the workforce, getting them involved in politics, which sounds great, right?
Yeah, on the surface.
But at the same time, all those traditional expectations, about childcare, about housework, all that stuff.
It didn't magically disappear, did it?
Not at all. It was like they were being pulled in two different directions.
So they were supposed to be these, super women working full-time and taking care of everything at home.
Basically. And often without any real support. So yeah, their visibility increased, but so did their workload.
That's a good point. It's completely different from Nazi Germany, where women were expected to stay home and, just have babies. But it's also kind of the same, isn't it?
How do you mean?
Well, they both kind of put motherhood on a pedestal, didn't they? Like that was the ultimate goal for women.
That's true, yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because even though they took totally different approaches, both regimes were ultimately trying to control women's lives.
By controlling their bodies, you mean?
Exactly. And it just goes to show that real equality, it's not just about like passing a law or making a speech. It requires a much deeper change.
A change in mindset.
Totally.
So to kind of bring it all together, it's pretty clear that both Hitler and Castro, they used social dynamics to their advantage, especially when it came to race and gender. But their methods were so different.
Night and day, really.
What are the key takeaways here? When we compare how they operated,
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that both regimes were masters of manipulation. Hitler, he was all about division, right? Exploiting those existing prejudices, turning people against each other.
divide and conquer.
Exactly. Whereas Castro, he used this promise of a classless society to kind of paper over the racial disparities that still existed.
So two sides of the same coin. One dividing to conquer, the other uniting to control.
Exactly. And I think the most important thing to remember is that these tactics, they don't just vanish, they're still relevant today.
You think so?
Oh, yeah. We see it all the time. People in power exploiting divisions, manipulating language, controlling the narrative.
It can happen anywhere, right?
Absolutely. It's a cautionary tale, really. It reminds us to be critical, to question what we hear, and to be wary of anyone who tries to divide us.
That's a great point to end on. It's easy to look back at history and think, oh, we're so much better now. But the reality is, we're not that different. We still face many of the same challenges.
We do.
So it's up to us to learn from the past so we don't repeat those same mistakes. So thanks for listening to this deep dive with us. We'll be back next time with another fascinating topic. Until then, keep asking those tough questions.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.